Section 1 of Chapter 24 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Carpenter. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 24, Section 1. The Gazette, which informed the public that the king had set out for Holland, announced also the names of the first members returned, in obedience to his writ, by the constituent bodies of the realm. The history of those times has been so little studied that few persons are aware how remarkable an epoch the general election of 1698 is in the history of the English Constitution. We have seen that the extreme inconvenience which had resulted from the capricious and headstrong conduct of the House of Commons during the years immediately following the Revolution had forced William to resort to a political machinery which had been unknown to his predecessors, and of which the nature and operation were but very imperfectly understood by himself or by his ablest advisers. For the first time the administration was confided to a small body of statesmen who, on all grave and pressing questions, agreed with each other and with the majority of the representatives of the people. The direction of war and of diplomacy the king reserved to himself, and his servants, conscious that they were less versed than he in military affairs and in foreign affairs, were content to leave to him the command of the army, and to know only what he thought fit to communicate about the instructions which he gave to his own ambassadors about the conferences which he held with the ambassadors of other princes. But, with these important exceptions, the government was entrusted to what then began to be called the ministry. The first English ministry was gradually formed, nor is it possible to say quite precisely when it began to exist. But on the whole, the date from which the era of ministries may most properly be reckoned is the day of the meeting of the Parliament after the general election of 1695. That election had taken place at a time when peril and distress had called forth all the best qualities of the nation. The hearts of men were in the struggle against France for independence, for liberty, and for the Protestant religion. Everybody knew that such a struggle could not be carried on without large establishments and heavy taxes. The government, therefore, could hardly ask for more than the country was ready to give. A House of Commons was chosen in which the Whig party had a decided preponderance. The leaders of that party had presently been raised, one by one, to the highest executive offices. The majority, therefore, readily arranged itself in an admirable order under the ministers, and during 3 sessions gave them on almost every occasion a cordial support. The consequence was that the country was rescued from a dangerous position, and when that Parliament had lived out its 3 years, enjoyed prosperity after a terrible commercial crisis, peace after a long and sanguinary war, and liberty united with order after civil troubles which had lasted during 2 generations, and which sometimes order and sometimes liberty had been in danger of perishing. Such were the fruits of the general election of 1695. The ministers had flattered themselves that the general election of 1698 would be equally favourable to them, and that in the new Parliament the old Parliament would revive. Nor is it strange that they should have indulged such a hope. Since they had been called to the direction of affairs, everything had changed for the better, and changed chiefly by their wise and resolute policy, and by the firmness which their party had stood by them. There was peace abroad and at home. The sentinels had ceased to watch by the beacons of Dorsetshire and Sussex. The merchant ships went forth without fear from the Thames and the Avon. Soldiers had been disbanded by the tens of thousands. Taxes had been remitted. The value of all public and private securities had risen. Trade had never been so brisk. Credit had never been so solid. All over the kingdom the shopkeepers and the farmers, the artisans and the ploughmen, relieved beyond all hope from the daily and hourly misery of the clipped silver, were blessing the broad faces of the new shillings and half crowns. The statesmen whose administration had been so beneficent might be pardoned if they expected the gratitude and confidence which they had fairly earned. But it soon became clear that they had served their country only too well for their own interest. In 1695, adversity and danger had made men amenable to that control to which it is the glory of free nations to submit themselves, the control of superior minds. In 1698, prosperity and security had made men querulous, fastidious, and unmanageable. The government was assailed with equal violence from widely different quarters. The opposition, made up of Tories, many of whom carried Toryism to the length of Jacobitism, and of discontented Whigs, some whom carried Whiggism to the length of Republicanism, called itself the Country Party, a name which had been popular before the words Whig and Tory were known in England. The majority of the late House of Commons, a majority which had saved the state, was nicknamed the Court Party. The Tory gentry, who were powerful in all the counties, had special grievances. The whole patronage of the government, they said, was in Whig hands. The old landed interest, the old Cavalier interest, had now no share in the favours of the crown. Every public office, every bench of justice, every commission of lieutenancy was filled with Roundheads. The Tory rectors and vicars were not less exasperated. They accused the men in power of systematically protecting and preferring Presbyterians, Latitudinarians, Arians, Socinians, Deists, Atheists. An orthodox divine, a divine who held high the dignity of the priesthood and the mystical virtue of the sacraments, who thought schism as great a sin as theft and venerated the icon as much as the gospel, had no more chance of a bishopric or a deanery than a papist recusant. Such complaints as these were not likely to call forth the sympathy of Whig malcontents. But there were three war cries in which all the enemies of the government, from Trenchard to Seymour, could join. No standing army, no grants of crown property, and no Dutchmen. Multitudes of honest freeholders and freemen were weak enough to believe that, unless the land force, which had already been reduced below what the public safety required, were altogether disbanded, the nation would be enslaved, and that, if the states which the king had given away were resumed, all direct taxes might be abolished. The animosity to the Dutch mingled itself both with the animosity to standing armies and with the animosity to crown grants. For a brigade of Dutch troops was part of the military establishment which was still kept up, and it was to Dutch favourites that William had been most liberal of the royal domains. The elections, however, began auspiciously for the government. The first great contest was in Westminster. It must be remembered that Westminster was then by far the greatest city in the island, except only the neighbouring city of London, and contained more than 3 times as large a population as Bristol or Norwich, which came next in size. The right of voting at Westminster was in the householders paying scot and lot, and the householders paying scot and lot were many thousands. It is also to be observed that their political education was much farther advanced than that of the great majority of the electors of the kingdom. A burgess in a country town, or a 40-shilling freeholder in an agricultural district, then knew little about public affairs except what he could learn from reading the postman at the alehouse, and from hearing, on the 30th of January, the 29th of May, or the 5th of November, a sermon in which questions of state were discussed with more zeal than sense. But the citizen of Westminster passed his days in the vicinity of the palace, of the public offices, of the Houses of Parliament, of the courts of law. He was familiar with the faces and voices of ministers, senators, and judges. In anxious times he walked in the great hall to pick up news. When there was an important trial, he looked into the court of King's Bench and heard Cowper and Harcourt contending, and Holt moderating between them. When there was an interesting debate in the House of Commons, he could at least squeeze himself into the lobby or the court of requests, and hear who had spoken, and how and what were the numbers of the division. He lived in a region of coffee houses, of bookseller shops, of clubs, of pamphlets, of newspapers, of theatres where poignant allusions to the most exciting questions of the day perpetually called forth applause and hisses, of pulpits where the doctrines of the high churchman, of the low churchman, of the non-juror, or of the nonconformist, were explained and defended every Sunday by the most eloquent and learned divines of every persuasion. At that time, therefore, the metropolitan electors were, as a class, decidedly superior in intelligence and knowledge to the provincial electors. Montague and Secretary Vernon were the ministerial candidates for Westminster. They were opposed by Sir Henry Colt, a dull, surly, stubborn professor of patriotism, who tired everybody to the death with his endless railing at standing armies and placemen. The electors were summoned to meet on an open space just out of the streets. The First Lord of the Treasury and the Secretary of State appeared at the head of 3,000 horsemen. Colt's followers were almost all on foot. He was a favourite with the keepers of pot-houses, and had enlisted a strong body of porters and chairmen. The two parties, after exchanging a good deal of abuse, came to blows. The adherents of the ministers were victorious, put the adverse mob to the rout, and cudgelled Colt himself into a muddy ditch. The poll was taken in Westminster Hall. From the first there was no doubt of the result, but Colt tried to prolong the contest by bringing up a voter an hour. When it became clear that this artifice was employed for the purpose of causing delay, the returning officer took on himself the responsibility of closing the books, and of declaring Montague and Vernon duly elected. At Guildhall the junto was less fortunate. 3 ministerial aldermen were returned, but the fourth member, Sir John Fleet, was not only a Tory, but was governor of the old East India Company, and had distinguished himself by the pertinacity with which he had opposed the financial and commercial policy of the First Lord of the Treasury. While Montague suffered the mortification of finding that his empire over the city was less absolute than he had imagined, Wharton, notwithstanding his acknowledged preeminence in the art of electioneering, underwent a succession of defeats in boroughs and counties for which he had expected to name the members. He failed at Brackley, at Malmesbury, at Cockermouth. He was unable to maintain possession even of his own strongholds, Wickham and Aylesbury. He was beaten in Oxfordshire. The freeholders of Buckinghamshire, who had been true to him during many years, and who, in 1685, when the Whig party was in the lowest state of depression, had, in spite of fraud and tyranny, not only placed him at the head of the poll, but put their second votes at his disposal, now rejected one of his candidates, and could hardly be induced to return the other, his own brother, by a very small majority. The elections for Exeter appear to have been in that age observed by the nation with peculiar interest. For Exeter was not only one of the largest and most thriving cities in the kingdom, but was also the capital of the west of England, and was much frequented by the gentry of several counties. The franchise was popular, party spirit ran high, and the contests were among the fiercest and the longest of which there is any record in our history. Seymour had represented Exeter in the Parliament of James, and in the first 2 Parliaments of William. In 1695, after a struggle of several weeks which had attracted much attention not only here but on the Continent, he had been defeated by 2 Whig candidates, and forced to take refuge in a small borough. But times had changed. He was now returned in his absence by a large majority, and with him was joined another Tory less able, and, if possible, more unprincipled than himself, Sir Bartholomew Shower. Shower had been notorious as one of the hangmen of James. When that cruel king was bent on punishing with death soldiers who deserted from the army which he kept up in defiance of the constitution, he found that he could expect no assistance from Holt, who was the recorder of London. Holt was accordingly removed. Shower was made recorder, and showed his gratitude for his promotion by sending to Tyburn men who, as every barrister in the Inns of Court knew, were guilty of no offence at all. He richly deserved to have been excepted from the Act of Grace, and left to the vengeance of the laws which he had so foully perverted. The return which he made for the clemency which spared him was most characteristic. He missed no opportunity of thwarting and damaging the government which had saved him from the gallows. Having shed innocent blood for the purpose of enabling James to keep up 30,000 troops without the consent of Parliament, he now pretended to think it monstrous that William should keep up 10,000 with the consent of Parliament. That a constituent body should be so forgetful of the past, and so much out of humour with the present, as to take this base and hard-hearted pettifogger for a patriot, was an omen which might well justify the most gloomy prognostications. When the returns were complete, it appeared that the new House of Commons contained an unusual number of men about whom little was known, and on whose support neither the government nor the opposition could with any confidence reckon. The ranks of the staunch ministerial Whigs were certainly much thinned, but it did not appear that the Tory ranks were much fuller than before. That section of the representative body which was Whiggish without being ministerial had gained a great accession of strength, and seemed likely to have during some time the fate of the country in its hands. It was plain that the next session would be a trying one. Yet it was not impossible that the servants of the crown might, by prudent management, succeed in obtaining a working majority. Towards the close of August, the statesmen of the junto, disappointed and anxious, but not hopeless, dispersed in order to lay in a stock of health and vigour for the next parliamentary campaign. There were races at that season in the neighbourhood of Winchenden, Wharton's seat in Buckinghamshire, and a large party assembled there. Orford, Montague, and Shrewsbury repaired to the muster. But Somers, whose chronic maladies, aggravated by sedulous application to judicial and political business, made it necessary for him to avoid crowds and luxurious banquets, retired to Tunbridge Wells, and tried to repair his exhausted frame with the water of the springs and the air of the heath. Just at this moment dispatches of the gravest importance arrived from Guelders at Whitehall. The long negotiation touching the Spanish succession had at length been brought to a conclusion. Tallard had joined William at Loo, and had met there Heinsius and Portland. After much discussion, the price in consideration of which the House of Bourbon would consent to waive all claim to Spain and the Indies, and to support the pretensions of the Electoral Prince of Bavaria, was definitively settled. The Dauphin was to have the province of Guipuscoa, Naples, Sicily, and the small Italian islands which were part of the Spanish monarchy. The Milanese were allotted to the Archduke Charles. As the Electoral Prince was still a child, it was agreed that his father, who was then governing the Spanish Netherlands as viceroy, should be regent of Spain during the minority. Such was the first partition treaty, a treaty which has been during 5 generations confidently and noisily condemned, and for which scarcely any writer has ventured to offer even a timid apology, but which it might perhaps not be impossible to defend by grave and temperate argument. It was said, when the first terms of the partition treaty were made public, and has since been many times repeated, that the English and Dutch governments, in making this covenant with France, were guilty of a violation of plighted faith. They had, it was affirmed, by a secret article of a treaty of alliance concluded in 1689, bound themselves to support the pretensions of the Emperor to the Spanish throne, and they now, in direct defiance of that article, agreed to an arrangement by which he was excluded from the Spanish throne. The truth is that the secret article will not, whether construed according to the letter or according to the spirit, bear the sense which has generally been put upon it. The stipulations of that article were introduced by a preamble, in which it was set forth that the Dauphin was preparing to assert by arms his claims to the great heritage which his mother had renounced, and that there was reason to believe that he also aspired to the dignity of King of the Romans. For these reasons, England and the States General, considering the evil consequences which must follow if he should succeed in attaining either of his objects, promised to support with all their power his Caesarian majesty against the French and their adherents. Surely we cannot reasonably interpret this engagement to mean that, when the dangers mentioned in the preamble had ceased to exist, when the eldest Archduke was King of the Romans, And when the Dauphin had, for the sake of peace, withdrawn his claim to the Spanish crown, England and the United Provinces would be bound to go to war for the purpose of supporting the cause of the Emperor, not against the French, but against his own grandson, against the only prince who could reign at Madrid without exciting fear and jealousy throughout all Christendom. End of section 1. Recording by Richard Carpenter in Seattle, Washington.
For Section 2 of the History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 24, Section 2. While some persons accused William of breaking faith with the House of Austria, others accused him of interfering unjustly in the internal affairs of Spain. In the most ingenious and humorous political satire extant in our language, Arbuthnot's History of John Bull, England and Holland are typified by a clothier and a linen draper, who take upon themselves to settle the estate of a bedridden old gentleman in their neighbourhood. They meet at the corner of his park with paper and pencils, a pole, a chain, and a semicircle, measure his fields, calculate the value of his mines, and then proceed to his house in order to take an inventory of his plate and furniture. But this pleasantry, excellent as pleasantry, hardly deserves serious refutation. No person who has a right to give any opinion at all about politics can think that the question whether two of the greatest empires in the world should be virtually united so as to form one irresistible mass was a question with which other states had nothing to do, a question about which other states could not take counsel together without being guilty of impertinence as gross as that of a busybody in private life who should insist on being allowed to dictate the wills of other people. If the whole Spanish monarchy should pass to the House of Bourbon, it was highly probable that in a few years England would cease to be great and free, and that Holland would be a mere province of France. Such a danger England and Holland might lawfully have averted by war. And it would be absurd to say that a danger which may be lawfully averted by war cannot lawfully be averted by peaceable means. If nations are so deeply interested in a question that they would be justified in resorting to arms for the purpose of settling it, they must surely be sufficiently interested in it to be justified in resorting to amicable arrangements for the purpose of settling it. Yet, strange to say, a multitude of writers who have warmly praised the English and Dutch governments for waging a long and bloody war in order to prevent the question of the Spanish succession from being settled in a manner prejudicial to them, have severely blamed those governments for trying to attain the same end without the shedding of a drop of blood, without the addition of a crown to the taxation of any country in Christendom, and without a moment's interruption of the trade of the world by land or by sea. It has been said to have been unjust that 3 states should have combined to divide a 4th state without its own consent. And in recent times the partition of the Spanish monarchy, which was meditated in 1698, has been compared to the greatest political crime which stains the history of modern Europe, the partition of Poland. But those who hold such language cannot have well considered the nature of the Spanish monarchy in the 17th century. That monarchy was not a body pervaded by one principle of vitality and sensation. It was an assemblage of distinct bodies, none of which had any strong sympathy with the rest, and some of which had a positive antipathy for each other. The partition planned at Loo was therefore the very opposite of the partition of Poland. The partition of Poland was the partition of a nation. It was such a partition as is effected by hacking a living man limb from limb. The partition planned at Loo was the partition of an ill-governed empire, which was not a nation. It was such a partition as is effected by setting loose a drove of slaves who have been fastened together with collars and handcuffs, and whose union has produced only pain, inconvenience, and mutual disgust. There is not the slightest reason to believe that the Neapolitans would have preferred the Catholic king to the Dauphin, or that the Lombards would have preferred the Catholic king to the Archduke. How little the Guipuscoans would have disliked separation from Spain and annexation to France we may judge from the fact that, a few years later, the states of Guipuscoa actually offered to transfer their allegiance to France on condition that their peculiar franchises should be held sacred. One wound the partition would undoubtedly have inflicted, a wound on the Castilian pride. But surely the pride which a nation takes in exercising over other nations a blighting and withering dominion a dominion without prejudice or energy, without justice or mercy, is not a feeling entitled to much respect; and even a Castilian who was not greatly deficient in sagacity must have seen that an inheritance claimed by two of the greatest potentates in Europe could hardly pass entire to one claimant, that a partition was therefore all but inevitable, and that the question was in truth merely between a partition effected by friendly compromise and a partition effected by means of a long and devastating war. There seems therefore to be no ground at all for pronouncing the terms of the Treaty of Loo unjust to the Emperor, to the Spanish monarchy considered as a whole, or to any part of that monarchy. Whether those terms were or were not too favourable to France is quite another question. It has often been maintained that she would have gained more by permanently annexing to herself Guipuscoa, Naples, and Sicily, than by sending the Duke of Anjou or the Duke of Berry to reign at the Escurial. On this point, however, if on any point, respect is due to the opinion of William. That he thoroughly understood the politics of Europe is as certain as that jealousy of the greatness of France was with him a passion, a ruling passion, almost an infirmity. Before we blame him, therefore, for making large concessions to the power which it was the chief business of his life to keep within bounds, we shall do well to consider whether those concessions may not, on close examination, be found to be rather apparent than real. The truth is that they were so, and were well known to be so, both by William and by Louis. Naples and Sicily formed indeed a noble kingdom, fertile, populous, blessed with a delicious climate, and excellently situated for trade. Such a kingdom, had it been contiguous to Provence, would indeed have been a most formidable addition to the French monarchy. But a glance at the map ought to have been sufficient to undeceive those who imagined that the great antagonist of the House of Bourbon could be so weak as to lay the liberties of Europe at the feet of that house. A king of France would, by acquiring territories in the south of Italy, have really bound himself over to keep the peace; for, as soon as he was at war with his neighbours, those territories were certain to be worse than useless to him. They were hostages at the mercy of his enemies. It would be easy to attack them. It would be hardly possible to defend them. A French army sent to them by land would have to force its way through the passes of the Alps, through Piedmont, through Tuscany, and through the Pontifical States, in opposition probably to great German armies. A French fleet would run great risk of being intercepted and destroyed by the squadrons of England and Holland. Of all of this Louis was perfectly aware. He repeatedly declared that he should consider the kingdom of the Two Sicilies as a source not of strength but of weakness. He accepted it at last with murmurs. He seems to have intended to make it over to one of his younger grandsons, and he would, beyond all doubt, have gladly given it in exchange for a 30th part of the same area in the Netherlands. But in the Netherlands, England and Holland were determined to allow him nothing. What he really obtained in Italy was little more than a splendid provision for a cadet of his house. Guipuscoa was then in truth the price in consideration of which France consented that the Electoral Prince of Bavaria should be King of Spain and the Indies. Guipuscoa, though a small, was doubtless a valuable province, and was, in a military point of view, highly important. But Guipuscoa was not in the Netherlands. Guipuscoa would not make Louis a more formidable neighbour to England or to the United Provinces, and if the treaty should be broken off, if the vast Spanish Empire should be struggled for and torn in pieces by the rival races of Bourbon and Habsburg, was it not possible, was it not probable, that France might lay her iron grasp not on Guipuscoa alone, but on Luxembourg and Namur, on Hainault, Brabant, and Antwerp, on Flanders east and west? Was it certain that the united force of all her neighbours would be sufficient to compel her to relinquish her prey? Was it not certain that the contest would be long and terrible? And would not the English and Dutch think themselves most fortunate if, after many bloody and costly campaigns, the French king could be compelled to sign a treaty, the same, word for word, with that which he was ready uncompelled to sign now? William, firmly relying on his own judgment, had not yet, in the whole course of this momentous negotiation, asked the advice or employed the agency of any English minister. But the treaty could not be formally concluded without the instrumentality of one of the Secretaries of State and of the Great Seal. Portland was directed to write to Vernon. The King himself wrote to the Chancellor. Somers was authorized to consult any of his colleagues whom he might think fit to be entrusted with so high a secret, and he was requested to give his own opinion of the proposed arrangement. If that opinion should be favourable, not a day must be lost. The King of Spain might die at any moment, and could hardly live till the winter. Full powers must be sent to Loo, sealed, but with blanks left for the names of the plenipotentiaries. Strict secrecy must be observed, and care must be taken that the clerks whose duty it was to draw up the necessary documents should not entertain any suspicion of the importance of the work which they were performing. The despatch from Loo found Somers at a distance from all his political friends, and almost incapacitated by infirmities and by remedies from attending to serious business. His delicate frame worn out by the labours and vigils of many months, his head aching and giddy with the first draughts from the Calebite spring, he roused himself, however, and promptly communicated by riding with Shrewsbury and Orford. Montague and Vernon came down to Tunbridge Wells and conferred fully with him. The opinion of the leading Whig statesman was communicated to the King in a letter which was not many months later placed on the records of Parliament. These statesmen entirely agreed with William in wishing to see the question of the Spanish succession speedily and peaceably settled. They apprehended that, if Charles should die leaving that question unsettled, the immense power of the French king and the geographical situation of his dominions would enable him to take immediate possession of the most important parts of the great inheritance. Whether he was likely to venture on so bold a course, and whether, if he did venture on it, any continental government would have the means and the spirit to withstand him, were questions as to which the English ministers, with unfeigned deference, submitted their opinion to that of their master, whose knowledge of the interests and tempers of all the courts of Europe was unrivalled. But there was one important point which must not be left out of consideration, and about which his servants might perhaps be better informed than himself: the temper of their own country. It was, the Chancellor wrote, their duty to tell His Majesty that the recent elections had indicated the public feeling in a manner which had not been expected, but which could not be mistaken. The spirit which had borne the nation up through 9 years of exertions and sacrifices seemed to be dead. The people were sick of taxes. They hated the thought of war. As it would in such circumstances be no easy matter to form a coalition capable of resisting the pretensions of France, it was most desirable that she should be induced to withdraw those pretensions, and it was not to be expected that she would withdraw them without securing for herself a large compensation. The principle of the Treaty of Loo, therefore, the English ministers cordially approved. But whether the articles of that treaty were or were not too favourable to the House of Bourbon, and whether the House of Bourbon was likely faithfully to observe them, were questions about which Somers delicately hinted that he and his colleagues felt some misgivings. They had their fears that Louis might be playing false. They had their fears also that, possessed of Sicily, he would be master of the trade of the Levant, and that, possessed of Guipuscoa, he would be able at any moment to push an army into the heart of Castile. But they had been reassured by the thought that their sovereign thoroughly understood this department of politics, that he had fully considered all these things, that he had neglected no precaution, and that the concessions which he had made to France were the smallest which could have averted the calamities impending over Christendom. It was added that the service which His Majesty had rendered to the House of Bavaria gave him a right to ask for some return. Would it be too much to expect, from the gratitude of the prince who was soon to be a great king, some relaxation of the rigorous system which excluded the English trade from the Spanish colonies? Such a relaxation would greatly endear His Majesty to his subjects. With these suggestions, the Chancellor set off the powers which the King wanted. They were drawn up by Vernon with his own hand, and sealed in such a manner that no subordinate officer was let into the secret. Blanks were left, as the King directed, for the names of 2 commissioners. But Somers gently hinted that it would be proper to fill those blanks with the names of persons who were English by naturalization, if not by birth, and who would therefore be responsible to Parliament. The King now had what he wanted from England. The peculiarity of the Batavian polity threw some difficulties in his way, but every difficulty gelded to his authority and to the dexterous management of Heinsius. And in truth the treaty could not but be favourably regarded by the States General, for it had been carefully framed with the especial object of preventing France from obtaining any accession of territory, or any influence on the side of the Netherlands. and Dutchmen who remembered the terrible year when the camp of Louis had been pitched between Utrecht and Amsterdam were delighted to find that he was not to add to his dominions a single fortress in their neighbourhood, and were quite willing to buy him off with whole provinces under the Pyrenees and the Apennines. The sanction both of the federal and of the provincial governments was given with ease and expedition, and in the evening of the 4th of September 1698 the treaty was signed. As to the blanks in the English powers, William had attended to his Chancellor's suggestion, and had inserted the names of Sir Joseph Williamson, minister at the Hague, a born Englishman, and of Portland, a naturalized Englishman. The Grand Pensionary and 7 other commissioners signed on behalf of the United Provinces. Tallard alone sighed for France. He seems to have been extravagantly elated by what seemed to be the happy issue of the negotiation in which he had borne so great a part, and in his next despatch to Louis boasted of the new treaty as destined to be the most famous that had been made during many centuries. William, too, was well pleased, and he had reason to be so. Had the King of Spain died, as all men expected, before the end of that year, it is highly probable that France would have kept faith with England and the United Provinces, and it is almost certain that, if France had kept faith, the treaty would have been carried into effect without any serious opposition in any quarter. The Emperor might have complained and threatened, but he must have submitted, for what could he do? He had no fleet, and it was therefore impossible for him even to attempt to possess himself of Castile, of Aragon, of Sicily, of the Indies, in opposition to the united navies of the 3 greatest maritime powers in the world. In fact, the only part of the Spanish Empire which he could hope to seize and hold by force against the will of the confederates of Loo was the Milanese. And the Milanese the confederates of Loo had agreed to assign to his family. He would scarcely have been so mad as to disturb the peace of the world when the only thing which he had any chance of gaining by war was offered him without war. The Castilians would doubtless have resented the dismemberment of the unwieldy body of which they had formed the head, but they would have perceived that by resisting they were much more likely to lose the Indies than to preserve Guipuscoa. As to Italy, they could no more make war there than in the moon. Thus the crisis which had seemed likely to produce an European war of 10 years would have produced nothing worse than a few angry notes and plaintive manifestos. End of Section 2, Chapter 24 of the History of England. Reading by S.T. Macduff. Chapter 24, Section 3 of the History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 24, Section 3. Both the Confederate kings wished their compact to remain a secret while their brother Charles lived, and it probably would have remained secret had it been confided only to the English and French ministers. But the institutions of the United Provinces were not well fitted for the purpose of concealment. It had been necessary to trust so many deputies and magistrates that rumours of what had been passing at Loo got abroad. Quiros, the Spanish ambassador at the Hague, followed the trail with such skill and perseverance that he discovered, if not the whole truth, yet enough to furnish materials for a despatch which produced much irritation and alarm at Madrid. A council was summoned, and sat long in deliberation. The grandees of the proudest of courts could hardly fail to perceive that their next sovereign, be he who he might, would find it impossible to avoid sacrificing part of his defenceless and widely scattered empire in order to preserve the rest. They could not bear to think that a single fort, a single islet, in any of the 4 quarters of the world was about to escape from the sullen domination of Castile. To this sentiment all the passions and prejudices of the haughty race were subordinate. "We are ready," such was the phrase then in their mouths, "to go to anybody, to go to the Dauphin, to go to the devil, so that we all go together." In the hope of averting the threatened dismemberment, the Spanish ministers advised their master to adopt as his heir the candidate whose pretensions it was understood that France, England, and Holland were inclined to support. This advice was taken, and it was soon everywhere known that his Catholic Majesty had solemnly designated as his successor his nephew Francis Joseph, Electoral Prince of Bavaria. France protested against this arrangement, not, as far as can now be judged, because she meant to violate the Treaty of Loo, but because it would have been difficult for her, if she did not protest, to insist on the full execution of that treaty. Had she silently acquiesced in the nomination of the Electoral Prince, she would have appeared to admit that the Dauphin's pretensions were unfounded. And if she admitted the Dauphin's pretensions to be unfounded, she could not, without flagrant injustice, demand several provinces as the price in consideration of which she would consent to waive those pretensions. Meanwhile, the Confederates had secured the cooperation of a most important person, the Elector of Bavaria, who was actually governor of the Netherlands, and was likely to be in a few months, at farthest, regent of the whole Spanish monarchy. He was perfectly sensible that the consent of France, England, and Holland to his son's elevation was worth purchasing at almost any cost, and, with much alacrity, promised that, when the time came, he would do all in his power to facilitate the execution of the Treaty of Partition. He was indeed bound by the strongest of ties to the Confederates of Loo. They had, by a secret article added to the treaty, agreed that, if the Electoral Prince should become King of Spain, and then die without issue, his father should be his heir. The news that young Francis Joseph had been declared heir to the throne of Spain was welcome to all the potentates of Europe, with the single exception of his grandfather, the Emperor. The vexation and indignation of Leopold were extreme. But there could be no doubt that, graciously or ungraciously, he would submit. It would have been madness in him to contend against all Western Europe on land, and it was physically impossible for him to wage war on the sea. William was therefore able to indulge, during some weeks, the pleasing belief that he had, by skill and firmness, averted from the civilized world a general war which had lately seemed to be imminent, and that he had secured the great community of nations against the undue predominance of one too powerful member. But the pleasure and the pride with which he contemplated the success of his foreign policy gave place to very different feelings as soon as he again had to deal with our domestic factions. And indeed, those who most revere his memory must acknowledge that, in dealing with these factions, he did not, at this time, show his wonted statesmanship. For a wise man, he seems never to have been sufficiently aware how much offence is given by discourtesy in small things. His ministers had apprised him that the result of the elections had been unsatisfactory, and that the temper of the new representatives of the people would require much management. Unfortunately, he did not lay this intimation to heart. He had by proclamation fixed the opening of the Parliament for the 29th of November. This was then considered as a very late day, for the London season began together with Michaelmas term, and even during the war the King had scarcely ever failed to receive the compliments of his faithful Lords and Commons on the 5th of November, the anniversary both of his birth and of his memorable landing. The numerous members of the House of Commons who were in town, having their time on their hands, formed cabals and heated themselves and each other by murmuring at his partiality for the country of his birth. He had been off to Holland, they said, at the earliest possible moment. He was now lingering in Holland to the latest possible moment. This was not the worst. The 29th of November came, but the King was not come. It was necessary that the Lords Justices should prorogue the Parliament to the 6th of December. The delay was imputed, and justly, to adverse winds. But the malcontents asked, with some reason, whether His Majesty had not known that there were often gales from the west in the German Ocean, and whether, when he had made a solemn appointment with the estates of his realm for a particular day, he ought not to have arranged things in such a way that nothing short of a miracle could have prevented him from keeping that appointment. Thus the ill humour which a large proportion of the new legislatures had brought up from their country seats became more and more aced every day, till they entered on their functions. One question was much agitated during this unpleasant interval. Who was to be Speaker? The junto wished to place Sir Thomas Littleton in the chair. He was one of their ablest, most zealous, and most steadfast friends, and had been, both in the House of Commons and at the Board of Treasury, an invaluable second to Montague. There was reason indeed to expect a strong opposition. That Littleton was a Whig was a grave objection to him in the opinion of the Tories. That he was a placeman, and that he was for a standing army, were grave objections to him in the opinion of many who were not Tories. But nobody else came forward. The health of the late Speaker Foley had failed. Musgrave was talked of in coffeehouses, but the rumour that he would be proposed soon died away. Seymour's name was in a few mouths, but Seymour's day had gone by. He still possessed indeed those advantages which had once made him the first of the country gentlemen of England: illustrious descent, ample fortune, ready and weighty eloquence, perfect familiarity with parliamentary business. But all these things could not do so much to raise him as his moral character did to drag him down. Haughtiness such as his, though it could never have been liked, might, if it had been united with elevated sentiments of virtue and honour, have been pardoned. But of all the forms of pride, even the pride of upstart wealth not excepted, the most offensive is the pride of ancestry when found in company with sordid and ignoble vices, greediness, mendacity, knavery, and impudence. And such was the pride of Seymour. Many even of those who were well pleased to see the ministers galled by his keen and skilful rhetoric remembered that he had sold himself more than once, and suspected that he was impatient to sell himself again. On the very eve of the opening of Parliament, a little tract entitled Considerations on the Choice of a Speaker was widely circulated, and seems to have produced a great sensation. The writer cautioned the representatives of the people at some length against Littleton, and then in even stronger language, though more concisely, against Seymour, but did not suggest any third person. The 6th of December came, and found the country party, as it called itself, still unprovided with a candidate. The King, who had not been many hours in London, took his seat in the House of Lords. The Commons were summoned to the bar, and were directed to choose a Speaker. They returned to their chamber. Hartington proposed Littleton, and the proposition was seconded by Spencer. No other person was put in nomination, but there was a warm debate of 2 hours. Seymour, exasperated by finding that no party was inclined to support his pretensions, spoke with extravagant violence. He, who could well remember the military despotism of Cromwell, who had been an active politician in the days of the Cabal, and who had seen his own beautiful county turned into a Golgotha by the bloody circuit, declared that the liberties of the nation had never been in greater danger than at the moment, and that their doom would be fixed if a courtier should be called to the chair. The opposition insisted on dividing. Hartington's motion was carried by 242 votes to 135. Littleton himself, according to the childish old usage which has descended to our times, voting in the minority. 3 days later he was presented and approved. The King then spoke from the throne. He declared his firm conviction that the Houses were disposed to do whatever was necessary for the safety, honour, and happiness of the kingdom, and he asked them for nothing more. And when they came to consider the military and naval establishments, they would remember that, unless England were secure from attack, she could not continue to hold the high place which she had won for herself among European powers. Her trade would languish, her credit would fail, and even her internal tranquillity would be in danger. He also expressed a hope that some progress would be made in the discharge of the debts contracted during the war. "I think," he said, "an English Parliament can never make such a mistake as not to hold sacred all parliamentary engagements." The speech appeared to be well received, and during a short time William flattered himself that the great fault, as he considered it, of the preceding session would be repaired, that the army would be augmented, and that he should be able, at the important conjuncture which was approaching, to speak to foreign powers in tones of authority, and especially to keep France steady to her engagements. The Whigs of the junto, better acquainted with the temper of the country and of the new House of Commons, pronounced it impossible to carry a vote for a land force of more than 10,000 men. 10,000 men would probably be obtained, if His Majesty would authorize his servants to ask in his name for that number, and to declare that with a smaller number he could not answer for the public safety. William, firmly convinced that 20,000 would be too few, refused to make or empower others to make a proposition which to him seemed absurd and disgraceful. Thus, at a moment when it was peculiarly desirable that all who bore a part in the executive administration should act cordially together, there was serious dissension between him and his ablest counsellors. For that dissension neither he nor they can be severely blamed. They were differently situated, and necessarily saw the same objects from different points of view. He, as was natural, considered the question chiefly as a European question. They, as was natural, considered it chiefly as an English question. They had found the antipathy to a standing army insurmountably strong, even in the late Parliament, a Parliament disposed to place large confidence in them and in their master. In the new Parliament that antipathy amounted almost to a mania. That liberty, law, property could never be secured while the sovereign had a large body of regular troops at his command in time of peace, and that of all regular troops, foreign troops were the most to be dreaded, had during the recent elections been repeated in every town hall and marketplace, and scrawled upon every dead wall. The reductions of the preceding year, it was said, even if they had been honestly carved into effect, would not have been sufficient, and they had not been honestly carried into effect. On this subject the ministers pronounced the temper of the Commons to be such that, if any person high in office were to ask for what His Majesty thought necessary, there would assuredly be a violent explosion, and the majority would probably be provoked into disbanding all that remained of the army, and the kingdom would be left without a single soldier. William, however, could not be brought to believe that the case was so hopeless. He listened too easily to some secret adviser, Sunderland was probably the man, who accused Montague and Somers of cowardice and insincerity. They had, it was whispered in the royal ear, a majority, whenever they really wanted one. They were bent upon placing their friend Littleton in the Speaker's chair, and they had carried their vote triumphantly. They would carry as triumphantly a vote for a respectable military establishment, if the honour of their master and the safety of their country were as dear to them as the petty interests of their own faction. It was to no purpose that the King was told, what was nevertheless perfectly true, that not one half of the members who had voted for Littleton could, by any art or eloquence, be induced to vote for an augmentation of the land force. While he was urging his ministers to stand up manfully against the popular prejudice, and while they were respectfully representing to him that by so standing up they should only make that prejudice stronger and more noxious, the day came which the Commons had fixed for taking the royal speech into consideration. The House resolved itself into a committee. The great question was instantly raised: what provision should be made for the defence of the realm? It was naturally expected that the confidential advisers of the Crown would propose something. As they remained silent, Harley took the lead which properly belonged to them, and moved that the army should not exceed 7,000 men. Sir Charles Sedley suggested 10,000. Vernon, who was present, was of opinion that this number would have been carved if it had been proposed by one who was known to speak on behalf of the King. But few members cared to support an amendment which was certain to be less pleasing to their constituents, and did not appear to be more pleasing to the court than the original motion. Harley's resolution passed the committee. On the morrow it was reported and approved. The House also resolved that all the 7,000 men who were to be retained should be natural-born English subjects. Other votes were carried without a single division, either in the committee or when the mace was on the table. The King's indignation and vexation were extreme. He was angry with the opposition, with the ministers, with all England. The nation seemed to him to be under a judicial infatuation, blind to dangers which his sagacity perceived to be real, near, and formidable, and morbidly apprehensive of dangers which his conscience told him were no dangers at all. The perverse islanders were willing to trust everything that was most precious to them, their independence, their property, their laws, their religion, to the moderation and good faith of France, to the winds and the waves, to the steadiness and expertness of battalions of ploughmen commanded by squires. And yet they were afraid to trust him with the means of protecting them, lest he should use those means for the destruction of the liberties which he had saved from extreme peril, which he had fenced with new securities, which he had defended with the hazard of his life, and which, from the day of his accession, he had never once violated. He was attached, and not without reason, to the Blue Dutch Foot Guards. That brigade had served under him for many years, and had been eminently distinguished by courage, discipline, and fidelity. In December 1688, that brigade had been the first in his army to enter the English capital, and had been entrusted with the important duty of occupying Whitehall and guarding the person of James. 18 months later, that brigade had been the first to plunge into the waters of the Boyne. Nor had the conduct of these veteran soldiers been less exemplary in their quarters than in the field. The vote which required the King to discard them merely because they were what he himself was, seemed to him a personal affront. All these vexations and scandals he imagined that his ministers might have averted, if they had been more solicitous for his honour and for the success of his great schemes of policy, and less solicitous about their own popularity. They, on the other hand, continued to assure him, and, as far as can now be judged, to assure him with perfect truth, that it was altogether out of their power to effect what he wished. Something they might perhaps be able to do. Many members of the House of Commons had said in private that 7,000 men was too small a number. If His Majesty would let it be understood that he should consider those who should vote for 10,000 as having done him good service, there might be hopes. But there could be no hope if gentlemen found that by voting for 10,000 they should please nobody, that they should be held up to the counties and towns which they represented as turncoats and slaves for going so far to meet his wishes, and that they should be at the same time frowned upon at Kensington for not going further. The King was not to be moved. He had been too great to sink into littleness without a struggle. He had been the soul of two great coalitions, the dread of France, the hope of all oppressed nations. And was he to be degraded into a mere puppet of the Harleys and the Hooves, a petty prince who could neither help nor hurt, a less formidable enemy, and a less valuable ally than the Elector of Brandenburg or the Duke of Savoy? His spirit, quite as arbitrary and as impatient of control as that of any of his predecessors, Stuart, Tudor, or Plantagenet, swelled high against this ignominious bondage. It was well known at Versailles that he was cruelly mortified and incensed, and during a short time a strange hope was cherished there that, in the heat of his resentment, he might be induced to imitate his uncles, Charles and James, to conclude another treaty of Dover, and to sell himself into vassalage for a subsidy which might make him independent of his niggardly and mutinous Parliament. Such a subsidy, it was thought, might be disguised under the name of a compensation for the little Principality of Orange, which Louis had long been desirous to purchase even at a fancy price. A despatch was drawn up containing a paragraph by which Tallard was to be apprised of his master's views, and instructed not to hazard any distinct proposition, but to try the effect of cautious and delicate insinuations, and, if possible, to draw William on to speak first. This paragraph was, on second thoughts, cancelled, but that it should ever have been written must be considered a most significant circumstance. End of Section 3, Chapter 24 of the History of England. Reading by S.T. Macduff. Chapter 24 of the History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. The History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 24, Section 4. It may with confidence be affirmed that William would never have stooped to be the pensioner of France. But it was with difficulty that he was at this conjuncture dissuaded from throwing up the government of England. When first he threw out hints about retiring to the Continent, his ministers imagined that he was only trying to frighten them into making a desperate effort to obtain for him an efficient army. But they soon saw reason to believe that he was in earnest. That he was in earnest indeed can hardly be doubted, for in a confidential letter to Heinsius, whom he could have no motive for deceiving, he intimated his intention very clearly. "I foresee," he writes, "that I shall be driven to take an extreme course, and that I shall see you again in Holland sooner than I had imagined." In fact, he had resolved to go down to the Lords to send for the Commons, and to make his last speech from the throne. That speech he actually prepared, and had it translated. He meant to tell his hearers that he had come to England to rescue their religion and their liberties, that for that end he had been under the necessity of waging a long and cruel war, that the war had, by the blessing of God, ended in an honourable and advantageous peace, and that the nation might now be tranquil and happy, if only those precautions were adopted which he had, on the first day of the session, recommended as essential to the public security. Since, however, the Estates of the realm thought fit to slight his advice, and to expose themselves to the imminent risk of ruin, he would not be the witness of calamities which he had not caused and which he could not avert. He must therefore request the Houses to present to him a bill providing for the government of the realm. He would pass that bill, and withdraw from a post in which he could no longer be useful. But he should always take a deep interest in the welfare of England, and, if what he foreboded should come to pass, if in some day of danger she should again need his services, his life should be hazarded as freely as ever in her defence. When the King showed his speech to the Chancellor, the wise minister forgot for a moment his habitual self-command. "This is extravagant, sir," he said. "This is madness. I implore your Majesty, for the sake of your own honour, not to say to anybody else what you have said to me." He argued the matter during 2 hours, and no doubt lucidly and forcibly. William listened patiently, but his purpose remained unchanged. The alarm of the ministers seems to have been increased by finding that the King's intention had been confided to Marlborough, the very last man to whom such a secret would have been imparted, unless William had really made up his mind to abdicate in favour of the Princess of Denmark. Somers had another audience, and again began to expostulate. But William cut him short. "We shall not agree, my lord. My mind is made up." "Then, sir," said Somers, "I have to request that I may be excused from assisting as Chancellor at the fatal act which your Majesty meditates. It was from my King that I received the seal, and I beg that he will take it from me while he is still my King." In these circumstances the ministers, though with scarcely the faintest hope of success, determined to try what they could do to meet the King's wishes. A select committee had been appointed by the House of Commons to frame a bill for the disbanding of all the troops above 7,000. A motion was made by one of the court party that this committee should be instructed to reconsider the number of men. Vernon acquitted himself well in the debate. Montague spoke with even more than his wonted ability and energy, but in vain. So far was he from being able to rally round him such a majority as that which had supported him in the preceding Parliament, that he could not count on the support even of the placemen who sat at the same executive board with him. Thomas Pelham, who had only a few months before been made a Lord of the Treasury, tried to answer him. "I own," said Pelham, "that last year I thought a large land force necessary. This year I think such a force unnecessary. But I deny that I have been guilty of any inconsistency. Last year the great question of the Spanish succession was unsettled, and there was serious danger of a general war. That question has now been settled in the best possible way, and we may look forward to many years of peace." A Whig of still greater note and authority, the Marquess of Hartington, separated himself on this occasion from the junto. The current was irresistible. At last the voices of those who tried to speak for the instruction were drowned by clamour. When the question was put, there was a great shout of no, and the minority submitted. To divide would have been merely to have exposed their weakness. By this time it became clear that the relations between the executive government and the Parliament were again what they had been before the year 1695. The history of our polity at this time is closely connected with the history of one man. Hitherto Montague's career had been more splendidly and uninterruptedly successful than that of any member of the House of Commons, since the House of Commons had begun to exist. And now fortune had turned. By the Tories he had long been hated as a Whig, and the rapidity of his rise, the brilliancy of his fame, and the unvarying good luck which seemed to attend him, had made many Whigs his enemies. He was absurdly compared to the upstart favourites of a former age, Carr and Villiers, men whom he resembled in nothing but in the speed with which he had mounted from a humble to a lofty position. They had, without rendering any service to the state, without showing any capacity for the conduct of great affairs, been elevated to the highest dignities, in spite of the murmurs of the whole nation, by the mere partiality of the sovereign. Montague owed everything to his own merit and to the public opinion of his merit. With his master he appears to have had very little intercourse, and none that was not official. He was in truth a living monument of what the Revolution had done for the country. The Revolution had found him a young student in a cell by the Cam, poring on the diagrams which illustrated the newly discovered laws of centripetal and centrifugal force, writing little copies of verses, and indulging visions of parsonages with rich glebes, and of closes in old cathedral towns, had developed in him new talents, had held out to him the hope of prizes of a very different sort from a rectory or a prebend. His eloquence had gained for him the ear of the legislature. His skill in fiscal and commercial affairs had won for him the confidence of the city. During 4 years he had been the undisputed leader of the majority of the House of Commons, and every one of those years he had made memorable by great parliamentary victories and by great public services. It should seem that his success ought to have been gratifying to the nation, and especially to that assembly of which he was the chief ornament, of which indeed he might be called the creature. The representatives of the people ought to have been well pleased to find that their approbation could, in the new order of things, do for the man whom they delighted to honour all that the mightiest of the Tudors could do for Leicester, or the most arbitrary of the Stuarts for Strafford. But strange to say, the Commons soon began to regard with an evil eye that greatness which was their own work. The fault indeed was partly Montague's. With all his ability he had not the wisdom to avert, by suavity and moderation, that curse, that inseparable concomitant of prosperity and glory, which the ancients personified under the name of Nemesis. His head, strong for all the purposes of debate and arithmetical calculation, was weak against the intoxicating influence of success and fame. He became proud even to insolence. Old companions, who a very few years before had punned and rhymed with him in garrets, had dined with him at cheap ordinaries, had sat with him in the pit, and had lent him some silver to pay his seamstress's bill, hardly knew their friend Charles in the great man who could not forget for one moment that he was First Lord of the Treasury, that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, that he had been a regent of the kingdom, that he had founded the Bank of England and the new East India Company, that he had restored the currency, that he had invented the Exchequer bills, that he had planned the general mortgage, and that he had been pronounced by a solemn vote of the Commons to have deserved all the favours which he had received from the Crown. It was said that admiration of himself and contempt of others were indicated by all his gestures and written in all the lines of his face. The very way in which the little jackanapes, as the hostile pamphleteers loved to call him, strutted through the lobby, making the most of his small figure, rising on his toe and perking up his chin, made him enemies. Rash and arrogant sayings were imputed to him, and perhaps invented for him. He was accused of boasting that there was nothing that he could not carry through the House of Commons, that he could turn the majority round his finger. A crowd of libellers assailed him with much more than political hatred. Boundless rapacity and corruption were laid to his charge. He was represented as selling all the places in the revenue department for 3 years' purchase. The opprobrious nickname of filcher was fastened on him. His luxury, it was said, was not less inordinate than his avarice. There was indeed an attempt made at this time to raise against the leading Whig politicians and their allies, the great moneyed men of the city, a cry much resembling the cry which 70 or 80 years later was raised against the English nabobs. Great wealth, suddenly acquired, is not often enjoyed with moderation, dignity, and good taste. It is therefore not impossible that there may have been some small foundation for the extravagant stories with which malcontent pamphleteers amuse the leisure of the malcontent squires. In such stories Montague played a conspicuous part. He contrived, it was said, to be at once as rich as Croesus and as riotous as Mark Antony. His stud and his cellar were beyond all price. His very lackeys turned up their noses at claret. He and his confederates were described as spending the immense sums of which they had plundered the public in banquets of 4 courses, such as Lucullus might have eaten in the hall of Apollo. A supper for 12 Whigs, enriched by jobs, grants, bribes, lucky purchases, and lucky sales of stock, was cheap at £80. At the end of every course all the fine linen on the table was changed. Those who saw the pyramids of choice wild fowl imagined that the entertainment had been prepared for 50 epicures at the least. Only 6 birds' nests from the Nicobar Islands were to be had in London, and all the 6, bought at an enormous price, were smoking in soup on the board. These fables were destitute alike of probability and of evidence, but Grub Street could devise no fable injurious to Montague, which was not certain to find credence in more than half the manor houses and vicarages of England. It may seem strange that a man who loved literature passionately and rewarded literary merit munificently should have been more savagely reviled both in prose and verse than almost any other politician in our history. But there is really no cause for wonder. A powerful, liberal, and discerning protector of genius is very likely to be mentioned with honour long after his death, but is very likely also to be most brutally libelled during his life. In every age there will be 20 bad writers for one good one, and every bad writer will think himself a good one. A ruler who neglects all men of letters alike does not wound the self-love of any man of letters. But a ruler who shows favour to the few men of letters who deserve it inflicts on the many the miseries of disappointed hope, of affronted pride, of jealousy cruel as the grave. All the rage of a multitude of authors, irritated at once by the sting of want and by the sting of vanity, is directed against the unfortunate patron. It is true that the thanks and eulogies of those whom he has befriended will be remembered, when the invectives of those whom he has neglected are forgotten. But in his own time the obloquy will probably make as much noise and find as much credit as the panegyric. The name of Maecenas has been made immortal by Horace and Virgil, and is popularly used to designate an accomplished statesman who lives in close intimacy with the greatest poets and wits of his time, and heaps benefits on them with the most delicate generosity. But it may well be suspected that if the verses of Alpinus and Fannius, of Bavius and Mavius, had come down to us, we might see Maecenas represented as the most niggardly and tasteless of human beings, nay, as a man who, on system, neglected and persecuted all intellectual superiority. It is certain that Montague was thus represented by contemporary scribblers. They told the world in essays and letters and dialogues and ballads that he would do nothing for anybody without being paid either in money or in some vile services. That he not only never rewarded merit, but hated it whenever he saw it. That he practised the meanest arts for the purpose of depressing it. That those whom he protected and enriched were not men of ability and virtue, but wretches, distinguished only by their sycophancy and their low debaucheries. And this was said of the man who made the fortune of Joseph Addison and of Isaac Newton. Nothing had done more to diminish the influence of Montague in the House of Commons than a step which he had taken a few weeks before the meeting of the Parliament. It would seem that the result of the general election had made him uneasy, and that he had looked anxiously round him for some harbour in which he might take refuge from the storms which seemed to be gathering. While his thoughts were thus employed, he learned that the auditorship of the Exchequer had suddenly become vacant. The auditorship was held for life. The duties were formal and easy. The gains were uncertain, for they rose and fell with the public expenditure. But they could hardly, in time of peace and under the most economical administration, be less than £4,000 a year, and were likely in time of war to be more than double of that sum. Montague marked this great office for his own. He could not indeed take it while he continued to be in charge of the public purse, for it would have been indecent and perhaps illegal that he should audit his own accounts. He therefore selected his brother Christopher, whom he had lately made a commissioner of the excise, to keep the place for him. There was, as may easily be supposed, no want of powerful and noble competitors for such a prize. Leeds had, more than 20 years before, obtained from Charles II a patent granting the reversion to Caermarthen. Godolphin, it was said, pleaded a promise made by William. But Montague maintained, and was, it seems, right in maintaining, that both the patent of Charles and the promise of William had been given under a mistake, and that the right of appointing the auditor belonged not to the Crown, but to the Board of Treasury. He carried his point with characteristic audacity and celerity. The news of the vacancy reached London on a Sunday. On the Tuesday the new auditor was sworn in. The ministers were amazed. Even the Chancellor, with whom Montague was on terms of intimate friendship, had not been consulted. Godolphin devoured his ill temper. Caermarthen ordered out his wonderful yacht, and hastened to complain to the King, who was then at Loo. But what had been done could not be undone. This bold stroke placed Montague's fortune, in the lower sense of the word, out of hazard, but increased the animosity of his enemies and cooled the zeal of his adherents. In a letter written by one of his colleagues, Secretary Vernon, on the day after the appointment, the auditorship is described as at once a safe and lucrative place. But I thought, Vernon proceeds, Mr. Montague was too aspiring to stoop to anything below the height he was in, and that he least considered profit. This feeling was no doubt shared by many of the friends of the ministry. It was plain that Montague was preparing a retreat for himself. This flinching of the captain, just on the eve of a perilous campaign, naturally disheartened the whole army. It deserves to be remarked that, more than 80 years later, another great parliamentary leader was placed in a very similar situation. The younger William Pitt held in 1784 the same offices which Montague had held in 1698. Pitt was pressed in 1784 by political difficulties not less than those with which Montague had contended in 1698. Pitt was also in 1784 a much poorer man than Montague in 1698. Pitt in 1784, like Montague in 1698, had at his own absolute disposal a lucrative sinecure place in the Exchequer. Pitt gave away the office which would have made him an opulent man, and gave it away in such a manner as at once to reward unfortunate merit, and to relieve the country from a burden. For this disinterestedness he was repaid by the enthusiastic applause of his followers, by the enforced respect of his opponents, and by the confidence which, through all the vicissitudes of a checkered and at length disastrous career, the great body of Englishmen reposed in his public spirit and in his personal integrity. In the intellectual qualities of a statesman Montague was probably not inferior to Pitt. But the magnanimity, the dauntless courage, the contempt for riches and for baubles, to which, more than to any intellectual quality, Pitt owed his long ascendancy, were wanting to Montague. End of section 4. Recording by S.T. Macduff. Chapter 24 of the History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 24, Section 5. The faults of Montague were great, but his punishment was cruel. It was indeed a punishment which must have been more bitter than the bitterness of death to a man whose vanity was exquisitely sensitive, and who had been spoiled by early and rapid success and by constant prosperity. Before the new Parliament had been a month sitting, it was plain that his empire was at an end. He spoke with the old eloquence, but his speeches no longer called forth the old response. Whatever he proposed was maliciously scrutinized. The success of his budget of the preceding year had surpassed all expectation. The 2 millions which he had undertaken to find had been raised with a rapidity which seemed magical. Yet for bringing the riches of the city, in an unprecedented flood, to overflow the Exchequer, he was reviled, as if his scheme had failed more ludicrously than the Tory Land Bank. Emboldened by his unpopularity, the old East India Company presented a petition praying that the General Society Act, which his influence and eloquence had induced the late Parliament to pass, might be extensively modified. Howe took the matter up. It was moved that leave should be given to bring in a bill according to the prayer of the petition. The motion was carried by 175 votes to 148, and the whole question of the trade with the Eastern seas was reopened. The bill was brought in, but was, with great difficulty, and by a very small majority, thrown out on the second reading. On other financial questions, Montague, so lately the oracle of the Committee of Supply, was now heard with malevolent distrust. If his enemies were unable to detect any flaw in his reasonings and calculations, they could at least whisper that Mr. Montague was very cunning, that it was not easy to track him, but that it might be taken for granted that for whatever he did he had some sinister motive, and that the safest course was to negative whatever he proposed. Though that House of Commons was economical even to a vice, the majority preferred paying high interest to paying low interest, solely because the plan for raising money at low interest had been framed by him. In a despatch from the Dutch embassy, the States General were informed that many of the votes of that session which had caused astonishment out of doors were to be ascribed to nothing but to the bitter envy which the ability and fame of Montague had excited. It was not without a hard struggle and a sharp pang that the first Englishman who has held that high position which has now long been called the leadership of the House of Commons submitted to be deposed. But he was set upon with cowardly malignity by whole rows of small men, none of whom singly would have dared to look him in the face. A contemporary pamphleteer considered him to an owl in the sunshine, pursued and pecked to death by flights of tiny birds. On one occasion he was irritated into uttering an oath. Then there was a cry of order, and he was threatened with the sergeant and the Tower. On another occasion he was moved even to shedding tears of rage and vexation, tears which only moved the mockery of his low-minded and bad-hearted foes. If a minister were now to find himself thus situated in a House of Commons which had just been elected, and from which it would therefore be idle to appeal to the electors, he would instantly resign his office, and his adversaries would take his place. The change would be most advantageous to the public, even if we suppose his successor to be both less virtuous and less able than himself. For it is much better for the country to have a bad ministry than to have no ministry at all. And there would be no ministry at all if the executive departments were filled by men whom the representatives of the people took every opportunity of thwarting and insulting. That an unprincipled man should be followed by a majority of the House of Commons is no doubt an evil. But when this is the case, he will nowhere be so harmless as at the head of affairs. As he already possesses the power to do boundless mischief, it is desirable to give him a strong motive to abstain from doing mischief, and such a motive he has from the moment that he is entrusted with the administration. Office of itself does much to equalize politicians. It by no means brings all characters to a level, but it does bring high characters down and low characters up towards a common standard. In power, the most patriotic and most enlightened statesman finds that he must disappoint the expectations of his admirers, that if he effects any good, he must effect it by compromise, that he must relinquish many favourite schemes, that he must bear with many abuses. On the other hand, power turns the very vices of the most worthless adventurer, his selfish ambition, his sordid cupidity, his vanity, his cowardice, into a sort of public spirit. The most greedy and cruel wrecker that ever put up false lights to lure mariners to their destruction will do his best to preserve a ship from going to pieces on the rocks if he is taken on board of her and made pilot. And so the most profligate Chancellor of the Exchequer must wish that trade may flourish, that the revenue may come in well, and that he may be able to take taxes off instead of putting them on. The most profligate First Lord of the Admiralty must wish to receive news of a victory like that of the Nile rather than of a mutiny like that of the Nore. There is, therefore, a limit to the evil which is to be apprehended from the worst ministry that is likely ever to exist in England. But to the evil of having no ministry, to the evil of having a House of Commons permanently at war with the executive government, there is absolutely no limit. This was signally proved in 1699 and 1700. Had the statesmen of the junto, as soon as they had ascertained the temper of the new Parliament, acted as statesmen similarly situated would now act, great calamities would have been averted. The chiefs of the opposition must then have been called upon to form a government. With the power of the late ministry, the responsibility of the late ministry would have been transferred to them, and that responsibility would at once have sobered them. The orator, whose eloquence had been the delight of the country party, would have had to exert his ingenuity on a new set of topics. There would have been an end of his invectives against courtiers and placemen, of piteous meetings about the intolerable weight of the land tax, of his boasts that the militia of Kent and Sussex, without the help of a single regular soldier, would turn the conquerors of Landen to the right about. He would himself have been a courtier. He would himself have been a placeman. He would have known that he should be held accountable for all the misery which a national bankruptcy or a French invasion might produce. And instead of labouring to get up a clamour for the reduction of imposts and the disbanding of regiments, he would have employed all his talents and influence for the purpose of obtaining from Parliament the means of supporting public credit and of putting the country in a good posture of defence. Meanwhile, the statesmen who were out might have watched the new men, might have checked them when they were wrong, might have come to their help when, by doing right, they had raised a mutiny in their own absurd and perverse faction. In this way, Montague and Somers might, in opposition, have been really far more powerful than they could be while they filled the highest posts in the executive government and were outvoted every day in the House of Commons. Their retirement would have mitigated envy, their abilities would have been missed and regretted, their unpopularity would have passed to their successors, who would have grievously disappointed vulgar expectation, and would have been under the necessity of eating their own words in every debate. The league between the Tories and the discontented Whigs would have been dissolved, and it is probable that in a session or two the public voice would have loudly demanded the recall of the best keeper of the Great Seal, and of the best First Lord of the Treasury the oldest man living could remember. But these lessons, the fruits of the experience of 5 generations, had never been taught to the politicians of the 17th century. Notions imbibed before the Revolution still kept possession of the public mind. Not even Somers, the foremost man of his age in civil wisdom, thought it strange that one party should be in possession of the executive administration, while the other predominated in the legislature. Thus, at the beginning of 1699, there ceased to be a ministry, and years elapsed before the servants of the crown and the representatives of the people were again joined in a union as harmonious as that which had existed from the general election of 1695 to the general election of 1698. The anarchy lasted, with some short intervals of composedness, till the general election of 1765. No portion of our parliamentary history is less pleasing or more instructive. It will be seen that the House of Commons became altogether ungovernable, abused its gigantic power with unjust and insolent caprice, browbeat king and lords, the courts of common law and the constituent bodies, violated rights guaranteed by the Great Charter, and at length made itself so odious that the people were glad to take shelter under the protection of the throne and of the hereditary aristocracy, from the tyranny of the assembly which had been chosen by themselves. The evil which had brought on so much discredit on representative institutions was of a gradual though of rapid growth, and did not in the first session of the Parliament of 1698 take the most alarming form. The lead of the House of Commons had, however, entirely passed away from Montague, who was still the first Minister of Finance, to the chiefs of the turbulent and discordant opposition. Among those chiefs the most powerful was Harley, who, while almost constantly acting with the Tories and High Churchmen, continued to use on occasions cunningly selected the political and religious phraseology which he had learned in his youth among the Roundheads. He thus, while high in the esteem of the country gentlemen, and even of his hereditary enemies, the country parsons, retained a portion of the favour with which he and his ancestors had long been regarded by Whigs and Nonconformists. He was therefore peculiarly well qualified to act as a mediator between the two sections of the majority. The bill for the disbanding of the army passed with little opposition through the House till it reached the last stage. Then at length a stand was made, but in vain. Vernon wrote the next day to Shrewsbury that the ministers had had a division which they need not be ashamed of, for that they had mustered 154 against 221. Such a division would not be considered as matter of boast by a Secretary of State in our time. The bill went up to the House of Lords, where it was regarded with no great favour. But this was not one of those occasions on which the House of Lords can act effectually as a check on the popular branch of the legislature. No good would have been done by rejecting the bill for disbanding the troops, unless the King could have been furnished with the means of maintaining them, and with such means he could be furnished only by the House of Commons. Somers, in a speech of which both the eloquence and the wisdom were greatly admired, placed the question in the true light. He set forth strongly the dangers to which the jealousy and parsimony of the representatives of the people exposed the country. But anything, he said, was better than that the King and the Peers should engage without hope of success in an acrimonious conflict with the Commons. Tankerville spoke with his usual ability on the same side. Nottingham and the other Tories remained silent, and the bill passed without a division. By this time the King's strong understanding had mastered, as it seldom failed, after a struggle, to master his rebellious temper. He had made up his mind to fulfil his great mission to the end. It was with no common pain that he admitted it to be necessary for him to give his assent to the disbanding bill. But in this case it would have been worse than useless to resort to his veto. For if the bill had been rejected, the army would have been dissolved, and he would have been left without even the 7,000 men whom the Commons were willing to allow him. He determined, therefore, to comply with the wish of his people, and at the same time to give them a weighty and serious but friendly admonition. Never had he succeeded better in suppressing the outward signs of his emotions than on the day on which he carried this determination into effect. The public mind was much excited. The crowds in the parks and streets were immense. The Jacobites came in troops, hoping to enjoy the pleasure of reading shame and rage on the face of him whom they most hated and dreaded. The hope was disappointed. The Prussian minister, a discerning observer, free from the passions which distracted English society, accompanied the royal procession from St. James's Palace to Westminster Hall. He well knew how bitterly William had been mortified, and was astonished to see him present himself to the public gaze with a serene and cheerful aspect. The speech delivered from the throne was much admired, and the correspondent of States General acknowledged that he despaired of exhibiting in a French translation the graces of style which distinguished the original. Indeed, that weighty, simple, and dignified eloquence which becomes the lips of a sovereign was seldom wanting in any composition of which the plan was furnished by William and the language by Somers. The King informed the Lords and Commons that he had come down to pass their bill as soon as it was ready for him. He could not indeed but think that they had carried the reduction of the army to a dangerous extent. He could not but feel that they had treated him unkindly in requiring him to part with those guards who had come over with him to deliver England, and who had since been near him on every field of battle. But it was his fixed opinion that nothing could be so pernicious to the state as that he should be regarded by his people with distrust of which he had not expected to be the object after what he had endeavoured, ventured, and acted to restore and to secure their liberties. He had now, he said, told the Houses plainly the reason, the only reason, which had induced him to pass their bill; and it was his duty to tell them plainly, in discharge of his high trust, and in order that none might hold him accountable for the evils which he had vainly endeavoured to avert, that in his judgment the nation was left too much exposed. When the Commons had returned to their chamber, and the King's speech had been read from the chair, Howe attempted to raise a storm. A gross insult had been offered to the House. The King ought to be asked who had put such words into his mouth. But the spiteful agitator found no support. The majority were so much pleased with the King for promptly passing the bill, that they were not disposed to quarrel with him for frankly declaring that he disliked it. It was resolved without a division that an address should be presented, thanking him for his gracious speech and for his ready compliance with the wishes of his people, and assuring him that his grateful Commons would never forget the great things which he had done for the country, would never give him cause to think them unkind or undutiful, and would on all occasions stand by him against all enemies. Just at this juncture tidings arrived which might well raise misgivings in the minds of those who had voted for reducing the national means of defence. The Electoral Prince of Bavaria was no more. The Gazette, which announced that the disbanding bill had received the royal assent, informed the public that he was dangerously ill at Brussels. The next Gazette contained the news of his death. Only a few weeks had elapsed since all who were anxious for the peace of the world had learned with joy that he had been named heir to the Spanish throne. That the boy just entering upon life with such hopes should die, while the wretched Charles, long ago half dead, continued to creep about between his bedroom and his chapel, was an event for which, notwithstanding the proverbial uncertainty of life, the minds of men were altogether unprepared. A peaceful solution of the great question now seemed impossible. France and Austria were left confronting each other. Within a month the whole continent might be in arms. Pious men saw in this stroke, so sudden and so terrible, the plain signs of the divine displeasure. God had a controversy with the nations. 9 years of fire, of slaughter, and of famine had not been sufficient to reclaim a guilty world, and a second and more severe chastisement was at hand. Others muttered that the event which all good men lamented was to be ascribed to unprincipled ambition. It would indeed have been strange if, in that age, so important a death, happening at so critical a moment, had not been imputed to poison. The father of the deceased prince loudly accused the court of Vienna, and the imputation, though not supported by the slightest evidence, was during some time believed by the vulgar. End of Section 5. Recording by S.T. Macduff.